So let's talk about centrists. And what better way to talk about centrists than to talk about this guy, Devin Del Vecchio, better known as ShortFatOtaku. Now, I live under a digital rock, and although I am somewhat active on social media, Dev was never a person whom I was all that familiar with. It wasn't until Andy Pants Gaming dropped his name among a list of so-called anti-woke content creators that I decided to give a proper examination of ShortFatOtaku. Now, to the eyes of more discerning people in social media, that name drop was a major indicator as to the shallowness of Andy Pants' perspective. A shallow perspective, of course, but appropriate when making content that appeals to normies and remains well within the confines of YouTube's terms of service. Andy Pants is one of the purest forms of controlled opposition, and to many limited to a surface-level perception of social media, one supposes ShortFatOtaku might as well appear like he is one among many fighting back against the woke tide through his rhetoric. Upon closer examination, however, one will find that Dev is also at the peak of controlled opposition. He is an enlightened centrist whose content is made to directly appeal to the forever fence-sitters. Dev's fame and fortune began as an outcropping of the drama surrounding Gamergate. In fact, it might not be too hyperbolic to assert that if there is any meaningful online discussion surrounding Gamergate, then Dev will do his dandiest to try to hijack that conversation and make it about himself in some way, shape, or form. And he's a bit like his buddy Carl Benjamin, a Sargon of Akkad, in that manner. Dev was one among many self-ascribed intellectuals, like Sargon of Akkad, and he picked up a crowd due anti-SJW sentiments and coverage of woke media. These so-called intellectuals usually had very humble beginnings. Dev was among many people who were talking about pop culture, video games, movies, and comic books. And then as pop culture began incorporating more and more left-wing propaganda, noticers noticed and created content about what they noticed. Say hello to video after video covering various scandals and controversies surrounding journalists and industry professionals who go on social media calling their consumers racists, misogynists, incels, or natsocks. And these videos were incredibly lucrative and cathartic at times. It was nice to believe that when people like Sargon or Thunderfoot or ShortFatOtaku were giving some base takes on feminism or social justice, that somehow their deep thunks were going to move mountains. Feminism beware these intellectual thunkers, because God knows women are governed by rational thought and hardly, if ever, driven by their emotions. And Dev is one in a long line of YouTubers who bestowed unearned intellectual value upon himself and his works. Unironically, a lot of platform giants have come and gone off the back of just telling everyone that they were highly intellectual. Just outright saying it is confirmation bias, never mind the vanity of making such a statement in the first place, even if it was true. Sadly, the self-ascribed intellectualism came off of conflating intellectualism with enlightened centrism. Centrism in name only, because it all just revealed itself to be a cover for more leftism. The way things used to work is your left-leaning centrist could establish himself as an intellectual because he was criticizing the correct people, the extreme left, calling them SJWs and wokesters alike. Now that push has come to shove, however, we see more and more that the average centrist is just another leftist. A leftist who really only cares about culture war stuff insofar as it aggrandizes himself. Now, as of my making this video, YouTube is recommending videos to me which have shown me that Dev's history is catching up to him. I don't believe he will be the only one, however, caught in the headlights. Internet historians closely engaged with the ongoing culture war are no doubt aware of what happened in 2017. A few months after the election of Donald Trump into his first term, things on YouTube saw a shakeup. For those who want a short history lesson on what I'm talking about, Jim, aka Internet Aristocrat, aka Mr. Medicare, has a video series about it, and I'll attempt to summarize that here. Mid-2017, a guy named Joseph Lanchester, aka Croughton T, made a tweet in a blatant attempt to cancel one Allison Pede, aka Rage After Storm. And the reason that Kraut resorted to these same slimy cancel culture tactics of the people that skeptics in his court spent years previously having to decry is because these skeptics were not the impartial centrists that they promoted themselves to be. That's one of the key things here. A lot of the reason the extreme left tolerated and continues to tolerate the anti-SJW or anti-woke crowds is because these people are still leftists at heart. They may not be as extreme as the SJWs then or the wokesters now, but many of them continue this masquerade as reasonable centrists, all the while not adhering to any discernible axioms of their own. As such, they will be easily melded, like clay. And part of the reason they persist on YouTube is because they have shown they can be controlled and corralled. And anyone who will not be controlled, sadly, is no longer or will no longer be on YouTube. And of course that too may change, given the result of last month's election. The problem that was in 2017 is the same as it is today, with many centrists. Much of the commentary community on YouTube will be scrutinized more than ever. People like Mahler, like Rags, like Asmongold, like Moist Critical, like Critical Drinker, Chris Ray Gunn, Turkey Tom, and of course, ShortFatOtaku. The list goes on, but the through line is that these people are without any clear ideology of their own, yet they persist with some belief that they are essentially always right, and anyone who opposes them is always wrong. And the basis for all that? I'm smarter than you are. Get with the program. Now, over time, I have kept tabs with Grift Wars CENTCOM, a lolcow compilation made by Joshua Moon, admin of the Kiwi farms. And what we see there is a larger list of coomers and product consumers, people who gave themselves to the appearance of holding to some higher standards, all the while pushing some worthwhile ideas into the vapid heads of their audiences. As time has gone on, however, the standards they once set for themselves have seemingly vanished on a whim. Various proving grounds have led us to this state. Things like the Plandemic, or the BLM riots, or the Me Too movement. And within those proving grounds, those who continually promoted themselves as being of high intellect and enlightened centrism uncannily seem to always fall within the camp of progressive extremists. In other words, those whom they in the past had criticized. But that's the thing, these people were never really centrists in the first place, much less the intellectual giants they claim to be. Because when their backs are against the wall, they've shown they are not truly capable of working through things intellectually. Now maybe they established a platform based on their eloquence, maybe they were charismatic, maybe they had a natural talent for what they did online, but the bulk of their influence relies on the Dunning-Kruger effect. Confidence over competence. As was the case with Crowton T, when confronted about his intellect, he inevitably resorted to cancellation tactics, rather than rational conversation. Now, to ensure I'm not just using generalities here, let us use another example aside from ShortFatOtaku. Charlie White, aka Moist Critical, had a mask-off moment which happened during a debate with one Nico de Balanthazi, aka Sneeko.
Do you believe that somebody can go through hormone therapy? Can they change their gender if they're a child?
I think that's totally fine as long as everyone is consenting, as you agree with.
Okay, but if then, the next day I leave it, I'm depressed, I want to cut my penis off, I can go right into the clinic, snip it off, and start taking HRT like Chris Tyson. That's a society that makes sense to you?
It is. I believe everyone has I believe everyone has the right to do with their body what they want to do.
You can get therapy, you can go through the process of making that decision. I thought that's what it was. I thought he was just speaking in hyperbole with the dick cutting off shit. I thought that's what we were talking about. And then if you decide that's the path you want to take, it is your body, you can do that. You can make that decision once you become of age to make a decision like that. I just don't understand how it got so muddled.
Bloodsports never died. To really appreciate this moment, you would have to consider the overall level of degeneracy that many of Charlie's viewers are witness to on a regular basis. Things like playing with giant plastic dicks or talking casually about pissing in someone's mouth. Regardless of all that, this is apparently where he crossed the line. But this is another problem with centrists. They fool you into accepting all kinds of degenerate behaviors, and they get away with it because the ability to tolerate degeneracy is seen as morally upright. Casting judgment on the sexual misadventures of others makes us appear prudent, but we should appear prudent. Charlie's lack of prudency is why he was so easily broken here by Sneeko. Sneeko sneakily exposed the fact that Charlie was not the consensus centrist that he appeared to be. The whole line of impartiality was a lie, and centrists will default to the extreme if pushed on their beliefs. I mean, if you look at this from the standpoint of far-left ideologues, did Charlie say anything that would be considered wrong, according to current year standards? And what this moment proved was that this ship has no captain. The centrist platform is forever in motion, forever at the mercy of the wind. And so let's get back to talking about ShortFatOtaku. Dev's foray into lolcowdom began amidst a scandal about Drag Queen Story Hour. About the same time that event was causing controversy for reasons such an event would cause controversy, Dev had decided to add his own skeptic or centrist take to the issue, which is essentially what led to his mask slipping. Now, Dev has a habit of oversharing his sexual interests and personal life, a keen indicator as to one's lolcow status. And regardless as to whether that is part of a humiliation fetish or just for attention seeking, it doesn't matter. But it is important to note with regard to the spiritual state of so-called centrists. The fact of the matter is your sex life is a keen indicator for your moral compass. If you choose to devote your sexual energies to fruitless endeavors like cutting in another man's that all goes to show that you're just an adherent to a culture of death and destruction. Another tangent. There are folks who have ridiculed me for following Synthetic Man who admits that he goons and has a fetish for futanari. What these people tend to ignore, however, is that Synthetic Man has never spoken about his proclivities in a manner that indicates that they have ever had a positive influence on his life. In fact, he admits the opposite is true. Sometimes he jokes about it, of course, but he does so at his own expense. For many lolcows who have the propensity to overshare their sexual proclivities, often they do so as a part of a humiliation fetish or invalidation seeking. For Dev, I assume the latter is the case. Same with Rags from EFAP, by the way. Validation for deviant sexual proclivities is a huge red flag and ought to be taken as a sign that such people are aligned spiritually with the likes of other deviants such as politicians or celebrities who would associate themselves with Jeffrey Epstein or Sean P. Diddy Combs. The internet also remembers that Dev made a clickbait video entitled, "Is it possible to be a moral?" And at the point of even writing such a title for a video, that should be enough of an indicator that you've gone way off the deep end. But this is all validation behavior. The drug addict needs to compel others to engage with his misbehaviors in order to alleviate his own guilt. And this is why our enlightened centrists often do default to the left, while the left and the right are equally capable of degeneracy. The key difference between the two is that one is apologetic for it, while the other revels in it. One is often held accountable for their actions, while the other is validated for them. Now, the reason I have an affinity for online personalities such as Synthetic Man is because Synthetic Man at least tells me that he adheres to one side of an extreme. And in his saying so, he does not have the leeway that many centrists do. Centrists trick you into thinking that you can forever play footsie with a fence, even as you spend half your time gooning to and the other half pretending to adhere to some higher standard. But the centrist lack of virtue becomes readily apparent amidst their sexual degeneracy. And that's why folks on the Kiwi farms were rightfully judgmental when it came to Dev's take on Drag Queen Story Hour. Dev found it appropriate to create a false dichotomy between Drag Queen Story Hour and sexual degeneracy in the Roman Catholic Church. If you were outraged at one of these stories but not the other, then you were a shit person whose tribal politics is more important to you than the harm done to actual children. Well, this is when you tip your hand too far and all the self-ascribed intellectual value reveals itself to be pure vanity. Because the woke have forever taken advantage of the moral values of others as opposed to their blatant rejection of any objective moral values in their own lives. And this is ultimately where the centrist will expose himself, when all adherence to some greater truth turns out to be all self-aggrandizement. What Dev did here was construct a straw man position where he got to play the part of the enlightened, sitting between a story about drag queens reading books to children and some scandal within the Roman Catholic Church. From that standpoint, he grants himself the ability to virtue signal his nuanced sensibilities and false concern over children. But just as readily as he defends said children, he was quick to abandon that concern when confronted about his morals. I wouldn't send my kids there, but to be honest, I don't give a shit if others want to do it. Well then, Dev, if it is all morally relative, why even bother strawmanning the issue beforehand? Now, what's the real danger that centrists pose to a more widespread think tank? Well, every now and again you'll see a label brought up that isn't well elaborated on, but needs to be understood. Synthetic Man had a brief aside about this during his election stream.
I guess it was this shotgun. Oh yeah, it was the shotgun thing. Yeah. About getting the mortgage guy to read the about how they're evil and all that. And you know, I get it. Like, I get you obviously can't encourage that on YouTube when you're a whitelisted creator who is obviously part of the controlled opposition, for being real. But it is deeply disappointing that, like, all the gun tubers, like, all these people, obviously, they love to pay lip service to the idea of a boogaloo or something. But we all know that they would join the Fed as soon as it would start, 100%. Because their actions speak louder than their words, which is that they associate with people who are controlled opposition. Like Actman went on the Unsubscribe podcast, and Actman is 100% a lefty, obviously. I mean, I believe he even joked and brought like a communist manifesto or whatever. But the point is, he is 100% a left-wing dude. And they choose to associate with him on their GunTube podcast when Actman probably thinks that people shouldn't even own guns. Even if he lied and said that he doesn't think that, I'm sure he does. The gun people are all controlled opposition. Wendigo's controlled opposite. Like, the Friday Night Tights people, they're centrist, grifter, libertarian people, so they're just in for the money. If YouTube started banning right-wing ideas, they would become left-wing overnight, 100%. And there's nothing stopping YouTube from doing that. The only thing that hypothetically is if an alternative site like Rumble actually could feasibly challenge their supremacy.
The label controlled opposition, unfortunately, lends itself to a common misconception, which Andy Pants Gaming took in a direction that led him to being properly ridiculed by the Act Man. To better explain what controlled opposition is, you need to think about who gets boosted by YouTube's algorithm. Who are the primary faces the platform recommends to you? Who are your influencers? At many times we assume that these people were just organically cultivated by widespread online engagement, and to some extent they are. But what should also be acknowledged is that they may otherwise have been handpicked by YouTube for the purposes of lulling everyone into a state of pacification. Controlled opposition means having your favorite YouTuber caress you with these false promises of how Lucasfilm's Kathleen Kennedy will eventually be fired for turning Star Wars into woke slop. And if we hold out long enough, eventually the writers at Disney will just get it right. Controlled opposition means we have some silly slurring Scottish guy tell us to stop noticing that a Norse goddess is a young black girl. That just spoils your enjoyment. And of course, controlled opposition means getting absurdly angry at some chud on YouTube, whom you were told was a literal Nazi, whose videos you've never seen, and whose content you were not even familiar with until just yesterday. Yes, indeed. Our totally legitimate and free-thinking centrist e-daddies on social media said that Synthetic Man was the real racist. You know, a while back I made a video about how ChatGPT doesn't curtail talking about wokeness in media, but the AI's understanding of wokeness fits within the constraints of censorship. I made a note about that concerning Smug Alana, a VTuber who might believe that she is based, but for whatever reasons, she reserves appropriate judgment when it came to Destiny's homosexuality. Unsubscribed. You're part of the problem. Despite not wearing the outward trappings of the enemy, centrists have nevertheless inscribed the leftist agenda upon their hearts, and that is why they are appropriately labeled as controlled opposition. They'll hold the visage of impartiality until it is no longer pragmatic for them to do so. Do not trust what these people say. Now, if you want to know why folks like Dev are being given a higher scrutiny now than ever before, my theory on it is that YouTube's general audience has grown up over the last 10 years. As people age, they start to crave new things. The problem with producing new things, however, is that someone has to move the needle. And the only way to move the needle is to ride the edge of YouTube's terms of service. Centrists don't know how to do that. They only know how to adapt. But the further the centrist does adapt, the more they make apparent their own lack of inner virtue. As I said about Moist Critical, centrists are at the mercy of the wind. Back in 2017, we saw the needle was moving in the direction of the so-called alt-right. And what happened then was various people around YouTube took what they needed from the alt-right before throwing them under the bus. And that is partially why we are able to talk about wokeness. But that's also why a lot of folks on YouTube will talk about noticing it, but stifle any meaningful discussion about it. And in addition to that, I believe the alt-right also helped to substantiate the concept of virtue signaling. My prediction now is that sometime mid-2025, something nasty is going to drop. And it's going to affect the centrist community. Another Crowton T moment, if one wills. Somewhere along the way, the mask of enlightened centrism and impartiality will slip. The tribe is going to be forced to reanalyze the status quo. In fact, I would say ground plans are already being made, even as everyone contemplates what their content will look like in the next 4 years. If I'm to get even more specific about this, I believe the drama will also involve the use of AI. AI to supplement for a lack of real innovative content. I somewhat elaborated on that in my short network coverage of slop tubers. But to get more specific, AI is going to push content creators into a realm where they will be forced to change the type of language that they use to convey their thoughts and feelings. They're going to have to do this in a manner that is distinct from what can be generated from an algorithm, and they have to do this all the while adhering to YouTube's terms of service. The edge of the fence is thin indeed, but that's what makes a channel like Synthetic Man all the more interesting. Synthetic Man is a canary in a coal mine. Sometimes I wonder if the folks at YouTube's helm are not otherwise turning his channel into some kind of social experiment, a place to analyze chud behavior. Regardless of that, I believe much of Synthetic Man's popularity is due similar sentiments surrounding the popularity of Donald Trump. Donald Trump was an outlier. Over the past 10 years, we saw many online platforms move steadily to the far left, making Synthetic Man an outlier on YouTube, and thus his popularity soared. Unintentionally, perhaps, the far left created their own monsters. And while ShortFatOtaku's presence on the platform will dwindle, for people like Synthetic Man, I believe Chancellor Palpatine has the best take on that.
We will watch your career with great interest.